Hello, everyone. My name is Gaëlle Moret, and I'm the exhibitions curator at the Ryerson Image Center. On behalf of the RIC, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight for a Tanenbaum lecture with the 2019 winner of the Scotiabank Photography Award, Stephen Waddell, based in Vancouver. Tonight's talk accompanies Stephen's current solo survey exhibition at the RIC, located both in our main gallery and on our Salah J. Bashir new media wall. I would like to start by acknowledging with respect the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples and their traditional territory of the dish with one spoon. The Ryerson Image Center stands within this territory today, and we respectfully accept our collective responsibility to the land during a time of environmental upheaval and crisis. While the Tanenbaum lecture series has had several names, from 1986 to 2013, it was sponsored by Kodak Canada and known as the Kodak Lecture Series. Through the years, over 230 photographers, filmmakers, media artists, photo historians, and curators addressed Toronto audiences on the Ryerson campus, including Eugene Smith, Bernice Abbott, Dawood Bey, Stan Brakhage, Robert Frank, Sally Mann, Michael Snow, and John Sarkovsky, among many others. The continuation of this acclaimed series was made possible by a generous gift from Howard and Carole Tanenbaum in 2014. I would like to take this opportunity tonight to offer a great thanks to the Tanenbaums for their ongoing generous support for this lecture series and other programs at the Ryerson Image Center. I'd like to mention a few program notes before we begin. We are recording tonight's event and we'll be uploading it onto our YouTube channel in the near future for those who weren't able to attend tonight or for those who would like to watch again. After the lecture tonight, we will commence a Q&A. If you have questions throughout the lecture, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen to submit them. Other listeners can use the upvote feature to vote for popular questions in case we do not have the time to address them all. And lastly, in the case of a technical difficulty, please remain patient while we correct the issue. It is now my pleasure to introduce Stephen Waddell's work and exhibition currently on view at the RIC. The exhibition highlights Waddell's experiments with various photographic techniques and processes and brings into focus his careful attention to scale and light. His poetic images, including his color street compositions of workers and pedestrians, along with his more recent black and white photographs of caves and grottos, reveal the artist's painterly sensibility, as well as a found and uncanny theatricality. In a newly created video for the Salah J. Bashir new media wall, Waddell revisits his earliest experiments with film from the late 1990s. This silent, non-narrative arrangement of Super 8 films can be defined as early sketches for his subsequent photographic tableaux. The exhibition is accompanied by a catalog published by renowned German publisher Steidl. You can buy this catalog online on our website or directly at the gallery. Please visit our website as we have made a number of changes to our operations. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Stephen Waddell.
Hello, Gaëlle. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to talk this evening. It's a sunny night in Vancouver. Great time to be on a Zoom call. Welcome to everybody who's joined. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody at the Ryerson Image Center for helping make my exhibition possible. Gaëlle for her curation, Paul Roth for being the director, of course, and taking us through this awkward period, and Valerie Mathieu-McCrory, of course, whose organization we all depend on. I'd also like to take this moment to thank those at the Scotiabank for awarding me the prize, all those responsible, all those involved. Still an honor. And very happy to be involved with the Scotiabank in terms of the prize and everything that obviously goes along with it in terms of getting a book and an exhibition. So this is my first Zoom talk, but I'm hoping it's going to go without seams and problems. But tonight I'd like to sort of describe, if I can, what I've been doing since the early 1990s. I would like to tonight describe some part of my fascination with realism, figuration, and photography. I have a number of slides tonight, but I'll begin with a few short pieces that are motion I've embraced photography for a long time in my work. I did not study photography, but it became an important disruptive force in my practice. We all employ photography. We use it for various reasons. One of the important lessons that I've probably learned over the last few years is how to study how others use photography, how I could, in fact, use it myself or develop it and make it something more intense, something more passionate, something more a part of all of my work. My basic training in the late 1980s consisted of very little in terms of formal instruction. Studio space was abundant in the late 80s in school, and we chewed through a steady diet of texts and essays, often painstaking accounts of our representational plight. Art historians and theoreticians excitedly announced the death of painting. Most representational practices, art practices, were seen as broken traditions, moral entropy, spectacular bourgeois excess. The de-skilling of art, which began decades before my studies, was now de rigueur. Post-avant-garde discourse had finally severed our burdensome ties to modernity, and with it, the retrograde pursuits of métier. The silent discourse of seeing and learning from artworks became an urgent way to move forward. I hadn't looked enough at the history of visual art, but was finding ways to do so. Books, things that I could look through in libraries, etc. My early work began in black and white in response to what I perceived as the somber discourse around photography and painting in North America. Starting as a painter had some advantages in determining how chance and imagination might function in my work. That pre-imagining process that I've been working with since the 90s is an important part of what I do when I'm preparing to photograph a subject inside or outside my studio. Early in the 1990s, I was learning how to construct and build a picture in paint. I was at the same time investigating what subjects I wanted to depict. My painting had something to do with realism, some attempt to study the eternality of figuration by recording the appearances of people. These are pictures called A Resting Worker series from 2000. I exhibited them and I made paintings of both the motif and exhibited the paintings and photographs side by side. That was an early experiment to work between the mediums and try to create a relationship, some kind of understanding about how colors could be seen, how gestures appear, how the actions of certain figures and people might appear in both mediums. This picture is important for me because it was shot with a very impractical small camera, but I had been looking around the area of Stuttgart in Germany when I had taken up residency there in 1997 and found this man in a drive-in theater taking in a rest next to his truck. For me, it was a metaphysical and existential moment where he felt that the drive-in theater itself, theater, would be that place for him. Here's a silent film, animated to repeat, but it's called Mädchen, or girl in German. Sketching or practicing seeing people emerge in the city using low resolution Polaroids or Super 8 film was a way of working on unfinished artworks. I could test what the colors would look like on film, and at times wondered if I was going to make an actual finished film or photograph. Seeing has always been important for my work, and I've used my observances of the world to create most of my pictures. This person was just sitting outside my studio, taking in the last hour of sunshine, but still covering their head and enjoying a cigarette. I shot it in higher frames per second, in other words, in slow motion, because I wanted to exaggerate the duration so that we could maybe study what in fact was going on, although we could finally realize nothing. This image called Königstrasse 5-9 Stuttgart is a woman with a camera. I recall a few moments in Germany making photographs in around 1996 and 97. I was just walking around looking for ideas, trying to get my feel for what I would do outside of the studio. Looking for people, it occurred to me that the stories of humanity could happen in isolation, not just in groups, that the single figure could surrender some kind of story or some kind of adjacent narrative. I was walking down the main pedestrian area in the new train station. I was making pictures of nothing, pockets of trash, odd crowd scenes. I saw a woman standing between travertine pillars, and she was holding a medium format camera and clandestinely photographing people while walking by. I photographed her because she symbolized, to me anyway, one of the great achievements of the history of photography, the inclination to make photographs unobserved, to avoid the theater of direct collusion. So I continued making pictures as studies, thinking that they might be sources for something else, wondering how the finished art would look like. I hadn't convinced myself yet that they were going to be photographs. So what came next is not really a divestiture in painting, but rather an unexpected looking through the camera and glimpsing approaches to photography I hadn't anticipated. Photojournalism and street photography appeared as genres to study and imagine how photographers of the past worked. I just didn't understand what they were doing, and I needed to make photographs to try and understand. I began my compulsion to record as much as I could see every day for years, and that coincided with that residency in Stuttgart. That residency was interesting because I was accepted as a painter, but I was told, do what you like. Make anything if you want to. If you don't make anything, that's fine too. I started to look at artists like Heinrich Zille, Walker Evans, and August Sander with closer looks. They were models for the appearance of the everyday. I'm still making paintings at this point from photographs, but there was mounting evidence that my photographs would require to be seen printed at life scale and experienced as artworks in their own right. I consciously wanted to skip the step of making and printing a group of photographs just slightly bigger than book size and finding an audience for them. That seemed wrong, and it seemed like a conventional approach I needed to avoid personally. I felt a need to make my connection with my painted works and engage with space and scale that one could readily see as though one was gazing upon the scene. Enlargement seemed to go hand in hand with my interest in figuration and the real. It was at this time that color became an energizing reason to hunt for encounters and experiences that would bring to the surface, of human figures in the chromatic urban environment. For a few years, I still used this small automatic point and shoot camera. It was readily available to myself. When it broke, I bought a new one. I could make pictures anywhere, anytime. But I was still having questions about whether I should do something else and use something else to record what I was doing. It was fulfilling the purpose, but I needed to think about something else. It was a challenge getting composed photographs with the very rudimentary cameras, but the immediacy of being able to expose a negative anytime meant that I was able to record encounters that would otherwise have been lost as pictorial events. I understood I needed a negative to work with later and not instant photography or a digital file similar to what we all produce on a daily basis with our phones now. I was traveling a lot in and around Europe, and in 1997, I saw a lot of old art, 19th century art, and specifically I tried to see any Edouard Manet painting on view. His use of color, his flat illusionistic rendering carried an immediacy I couldn't get enough of. So it was at this point I recall seeing in color and working in color. This is a piece that I shot in Berlin in Treptow, right along the lake. And it was one of the first pieces that I was definitely convinced had to be a large photograph. And by large, I mean as close to bodily reception as possible. So in and around 2001, between 2000 and 2001, I wanted to change things around and maybe move away from something that was easy to something that was more difficult, maybe ambitious, I don't know. I obtained a photojournalist film camera, and at some point I saw that I could work faster, maintain focus, create a distance from subject that meant something for me immediately. I could frame and I could capture motion. And I could have a rapidity, in other words, repeated number of frames so that I could have more than one to choose from. Until now, the pictures I've shown you are all one frame. There's no choice. I either got it or I didn't got it. That rapid camera was something I could drag around and depend on. This series, Asphalt Layer, was one of the first pictures in Berlin that I shot using that new kind of camera and moving into, finally, other subjects that I thought could be handled by that camera. I was still ensconced with the results of 35mm negatives, what they could yield. In other words, what you could print with them. I was printing C prints at the time, but I was also anticipating I could drum scan them and make them quite large, knowing that the grain structure, that drum scanning could go beyond grain structure and I could replicate the actual look of the film. I could shoot a great many frames and economy of it seemed right. I believed I'd moved past the idea of making unfinished work finally. And I was now trying to see finished scenes in scale, composition, and color right through the viewfinder. I was also working through ideas of what I wanted to see, encounters to embrace. I was ready to be surprised. I wanted my pictures to have the quality of imagination, but have a relationship to the past. The asphalt layer has been compared to the floor scrapers. Probably when I shot the picture, I wasn't immediately thinking of it, but it was obvious afterwards. So some of the relationships to painting, albeit they're not so important, but they are interesting sometimes to look back and think about. This is an asphalt layer that I shot a few years later. Couldn't help myself. The process of laying asphalt reminded me of maybe Jackson Pollock making a painting or some kind of sculptor trying to smear some amorphous, chaotic, hot liquid down in order to create some other surface, like a skin of the city. Everything about the city interested me at that point, like how to cover things up, why were things covered up, why were things done by hand, how was labor conducted, and how related were we to the past, or did we think we were completely separate from the past? Now, asphalt layers have been photographed many times in the history of photography. Eugene Atget and others used these motifs to drive a lot of their subjects, considered to be small work or petit métier. Once I had established a slightly new way of working, I wanted to find out for myself what realism could mean, what it could mean in my work. I'd sort of already understood basically through painting and depiction what realism meant to me, but it was changing slightly because I was starting to think more about the history of photography. I was starting to think more about cinema. cinema verite, the idea that accurate descriptions of everyday life without false idealizations or artificiality, sometimes described as an authentic recording, realism of the everyday, the realist tradition in the 19th century was increasingly associated with gritty subjects, treated in an unmistakably evident manner. Naturalism came to be associated with realism as a mode of expression at odds with certain notions of romanticism. For me, there's a long line of history making that infuses my work. What I found is I'm keen to make work about primary perception, perception of colors, movements, gestures, sounds, surfaces, and many more things. Seeing is somewhat like having a direct insight in the mind about something that needs to become visible as an expression. I can't describe the convergence of seeing and the imaginability of a scene, but I know that photography is proof that it happens. Some artists are good at relating their direct perceptions, and some are better at channeling their fantasies. Previous image was a woman on Capri, which had a direct cinema feel. A lot of the time I spent in Berlin looking for people to make pictures of, I would often find people in acts of creation. And throughout this presentation, I will go move between, let's call it acts of work or labor, activities of leisure, and subtle acts of creativity, maybe even itinerant creativity. The futility, yet the kind of utility of this disentangler picture always fascinates me. People sketching. People at the beach. This picture fascinates me because of the figure-ground relationships that our protagonist, the woman at the front, leaning against the log, is presiding over the picture. And she's indeed the most important character, but we can't assign some kind of thought to what she's doing. We just know she's probably absorbed and maybe watching what we're watching. I also became interested in what groups of figures might look like. Again, in the cinema vein, that as though you would just photograph the street or make a film of the street. Groups of figures together that don't necessarily go together, but then form a kind of narrative on film, in picture form. I found I was able to study faces and see how things repeated or how things look like something out of a historical photograph, but then they were completely of that moment. Universal Man is an interesting picture for me because it represents the introduction of chance again. You suddenly create a double exposed roll of film. It's not something you do in a digital practice, but once you've done it and you have processed it and looked at it, you realize it's either nothing or it's something. And in this case, I was very interested in this singular solitary figure who was now enmeshed in another series of images. So figuration, this dissolved figuration represented for me the alienation of the city. And street photography could be dissolved and moved left, right, across, and through, and create new kinds of ways of seeing for myself. I couldn't necessarily say whether they were successful, but for me, it was moving in directions I wanted to go. So figuration, spoken a little bit about realism and how that trajectory may have gone, still around, of course. I'm still basically plucking at the same 1 or 2 or 3 strings on my guitar I haven't added any more. I could, but I don't know if I will play much. Figuration. It's been interesting to me forever. I don't know, even as a kid, maybe because I drew from the model and I drew still lives as a teenager. Maybe all those years of just dealing with the evident and the real, I've felt drawn to figures. There's seemingly infinite possibilities when you begin looking at what figuration has done in art and what it could do. Figuration is at the core of photography and most photojournalism. As an artist, one can represent a crowd, or you can represent a few, or the one. There's something vital about each one of those conditions. Portraiture often builds a resemblance, maybe even knowledge. Images of crowds say something about our human condition, and the isolated solitary figure reminds us of our existence as individuals. When I finally made the move towards photography, I decided I need to make my photographs very simple, composing scenes with a reduced number of elements. I was still trying to bring forward my interest in the solitary figures that I had seen in Manet, in Velázquez, and in films by Bresson, for instance, his film Mouchette. Or even in the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, who we sort of all know as the solitary figure standing on the edge of a mountaintop, looking out to a vast sea of unknown romantic landscape. We can't know what those figures are thinking. We can maybe be absorbed into their absorption. That's up for question. It occurred to me that I can make pictures of human beings from behind, isolated and involved in their private thoughts, perhaps expressing, in their private thoughts, perhaps expressing some metaphysical condition that we all experience from time to time. This approach led me to consider more closely Baudelaire's idea that every time and place has its own intrinsic beauty. The everyday of Berlin offered many instances of the isolated figures meandering through large sections of ruined, transformed, and transforming urban landscape. There became and remain types of activities that I find produce the rich ambiguity of images that I've tried to make and tried to present. This is a picture called Coal Carrier, 2004. There's two sets of pictures, coal carriers and chimney sweeps, who I started to work in direct collusion with in order to, should I say, increase the focus or increase the ambition of certain compositions that I wanted to make. I started using, at this point, a sort of next step. I jumped to a slower medium format camera, something that could capture more onto film and potentially create a larger printed image. Could either be scanned or printed even bigger than I'd been working before. And so I found that this 6 by 7 centimeter negative, which is fairly common in the world of photography, to be a very good sort of marriage of portability, but also clarity and detail grabbing. Pictures about labor at work, once again, echoing August Sander, seemed to be an assignment I could give myself. But I could still concentrate on my newly found interests, which were working through color. So here we have coal, the color of the sky, it's reflected in the coal. We have the reflected light of what is a sunny afternoon in Berlin along a very big street. And the faceless character for whom we either have some empathetic moment or some absorptive reaction to. Chimney Sweep was a picture that I very much enjoyed making because it tied in my interests of Adolf Menzel, who made pictures of Berlin rooftops, but also the notion of the chimney sweep themselves, that these people would be on the rooftops looking around and for reasons of safety completing their work, but that they had this, again, anachronistic feel, this relationship to the past, but it was happening now in real time. And I felt that if I could make a half decent photograph, a single work about that, I would be happy. And this woman was kind enough to let me follow her and work with her for days on end. So in terms of figuration, there's so many subcategories of pictures that I've learned to make, or I've learned about, or I've found and learned about, and I'll mention a few here. Idleness or recreation or leisure or whatever you want to call it, but it's that in-between time that has influenced a lot of why to make things, how to make things, where to be, where to go. This picture called Lookout, which is the top of a what's called the Freedom Monument in Berlin, has figured in films, but is an interesting spot for which to look at Berlin, but it has this very beautiful gold railing around the lookout point. And this was an afternoon in May that I decided that I could make a picture up there. This is chance. I had no idea what I was going to make, but this is what I made. So gardens and places where people walk through, things that mimic the city but aren't the city, or things that are part of the city but try to mimic nature. For instance, this picture from Tokyo, these kinds of gardens mimic landscape outside of cities. So this particular park is a kind of replication or a small map of a landscape somewhere outside of Yokohama. And I constantly find, if I move different places, even cities, I mean, I haven't done that much moving around the world, but I've been to a few places, and I find it doesn't take long before I start seeing people and events and things that fascinate me. Tiergarten Berlin, I guess I feel lucky that I was able to photograph so much there. This is called Tiergarten Diptych. I shot it in 2010, just recently presented it. It's a two-part picture shot in the spring of two characters, one witnessed in both, and another character, the woman in the ochre sweater in the right-hand side panel. Again, idleness or time where people contemplate maybe their own existence, maybe it's a self-reflective moment, maybe they're just absorbed, maybe they're distracted, I don't know. But these kinds of moments I still find important. Man sketching. It doesn't matter that this is shot in Tokyo, but maybe there are clues that say something about Japanese culture, very, very subtle clues. But a picture like this probably has more resonance for me because it's a man making a sketch of a building in front of him. We can't see the building, but as I went around him, I saw the drawing he was making. But I thought, what a peculiar place to make a sketch. I better make a picture of that. Boy and Stump is another one of those pictures that has to do with park, dwelling, agency, nature, gesture, the history of painting, looking at others. This boy was actually looking at a group of people. I asked to make a picture of him, but I waited until he thought I wasn't making a picture anymore, till he felt he was distracted enough to look away and look at his group. And that's when I made my picture. So some of these pictures occur to me just as I'm shooting them, that they might come from motifs I've seen in painting or even in photography. Or they could also have been things that I've seen before that I wasn't able to photograph. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to see things similar twice or in another way. As I mentioned before, Heinrich Zille is a very interesting artist whose illustrations of the sort of modern times of Berlin were comical illustrations related to the grittiness and eroticism of the city. And he also made photographs too that represented people moving through the city, people moving their stuff from one building to another, carnivals, festivals, all sorts of people. So Berlin in the late 90s and early 2000s seemed to me have a lot of relationship to Zilla's work. Painted signposts, intentionally piled up detritus, homemade posters, installations of anonymous sculptures, sketching in the street, projections at night. This was all the work as play. Leisure in Berlin seemed to grow from the streets and the parks. There was no sense that leisure couldn't be accommodated in most walks of life. I was looking for figures, all kinds of, and encountered laborers, workers, attendees to museums, park dwellers, pedestrians, writers, readers, idlers, conspirators, to name just a few. Alexanderplatz was near my studio, and this particular picture, Man with Heavy Sack, was near my studio in Berlin. And in fact, a great deal of the pictures that I'm actually showing tonight were all shot within, I would say, 100 to 150 meters of each other, near the Lustgarten. This picture still is important for me for many reasons, but one of the reasons is in terms of figuration, and in terms of the in-between. This man is missing his head. The bag has replaced it. So we are now into a territory of what has been a reoccurring theme for hundreds of years. If people had made photographs since the 1500s, we would probably have seen a similar person walking down the street carrying a similar bag. So the eternal reoccurrence, or the return of both negative and positive feelings when you see things that you know are eternal, still fascinate me in terms of the figuration that I might be able to develop in my work. This is just a little idea of what was going on when I was shooting in those days, that once I developed the new habit of the 35mm camera, I had contacts, and those contacts could reveal a lot about what I was doing, but it was more choice now. And that led to other decisions about what was the best shot, what was the best picture. And just as background, the reason also I shot that picture of Man with Heavy Sack was because I'd recently been to Madrid and seen this Goya painting of this man at the bottom of this witch's flight picture with a cape draped over himself. It reminded me in similar fashion to a kind of the headless picture of my Man with Heavy Sack. So I moved around a lot. I went to different cities, trying to just continue to find images and compositions and colors. For instance, the travertine marble versus the woman's habit on a bright sunny day. Eternal reoccurrences of events in Vancouver also interested me. This is near my studio in Vancouver. Man with green mask. This is a handmade mask. I couldn't help but think that he'd made that mask, and that he was moving down the street with this presentation of this mask for good reason. Maybe just for me, I don't know, but it impressed me nonetheless. So I'll go back and forth between what we call leisure and work. Park scenes still interested me. Berlin had a preponderance of people with a lot of time on their hands. Somehow coming from North America, I was not used to, should we call, directed and positive idleness in the same way. And so there was more time for me to do what I wanted, but then I found myself around other people who also had a lot of time. Picture called Arbutus Corridor, Vancouver. So these pictures are all based on chance. And I'm leading up to where things start to change for me, where I'm slowly trying to figure out how to get around pictures only built on chance. This picture called Confirstendam 225. This is a picture I tried to shoot twice, actually 3 times. I'd seen this woman come out and preside over the entrance of this building for some time. And I hadn't understood how to photograph her because she would always leave within 2 or 3 minutes. And finally I had a chance and I stopped and I got the picture. Again, a lot of my work was dealing with color as though I'd never seen color before. Albeit I'd worked somewhat in color when I was making paintings. I'd never really gotten ambitious about it. And so these kinds of pictures remind me that for a period of time, that's all I could think about. So chance and imagination. And let's maybe even call it the unrepresentable. Like what is it about a picture besides just being a witness that could be energized? I guess most artists try to balance chance and imagination in their work. Some artists are trying to invite more chance into their work, and some artists are intent on subduing it. Starting around 2002, when I started using large format cameras, I began to collude with some subjects, look for the pre-imagined circumstances, and attempted to photograph the same subject a few times. This picture, called Wrestlers, is a picture that I had conceived of because I had seen gatherings like this and planned and worked around getting it. This is the largest color picture that I've made to date. Something like 8 foot wide. And it was an important first step for me in terms of material presentation. The role of stillness has been important. I'll just quickly say something about that. There are certain pictures that I make that have a stillness in them and a duration, which becomes important in terms of the kind of figuration, the kind of realism that they are exuding. That door on the sidewalk is important. People at work, but we need to acknowledge the quietness and the stillness of the picture in order to get into it, to fully understand if there is something more to be understood, some kind of unrepresentable moment. So this is a woman restoring marble, the mimesis of restoring something that is just a pattern. It's a painting, but it's meant to be marble. The seriousness of her work, for which she conducted herself, seemed to be the important part of the picture. Goatherd looked like a diorama to me when I saw it, and even when I shot it, it still looked like a diorama. This is shot in Lebanon a few years ago. Rock's Twilight, another diorama-looking picture. And Stilling of Motion, also interesting for me. This is a picture called Stain. This marks the beginning of my departure into black and white photography in 2012. I began to think about black and white photography and its relationship to the darkroom, potentialities from change from my color investigations, and the idea of the handmade, something I could work on in terms of making art from beginning to end. I could shoot black and white negatives. I could print them in the darkroom, and the gestures and dances in front of the optical projector would be how I would change things. So I began thinking about, I'll go back to Stain for a moment. I began thinking about the underground. Everything I had done till now was above ground. It was about the city, it was about color, it was about its inhabitants, it was about figuration. And so when another investigation seemed possible was wondering and thinking about the origins of art, about drawing on cave walls. What was that about, and how did that relate to things that came afterwards? Why was it underground only at some point? So I wanted to make work about the underground. And I went to many caves making pictures that were using my lighting or illumination that was present. So this reminding myself about the origins of art and about staining and about drawing was also about how to see representational forms in the abstract, if it's possible, or whether it was just a condition that we need to follow because of our patternized learning behavior. This is in Lebanon as well. This is the Gita Grotto. This is using the illumination of the cave. So these are large, very large black and white photographs. In some cases, 3 strips of darkroom paper, which would be glued onto a substrate and would become 11 by 14 foot in presentation form, rawly displayed, no frame, no glazing, just the raw materials. This is actually should we call it a shadow self-portrait? Here's an installation view from Vancouver Art Gallery for this Dark Matter Atlas exhibition that these large cave pictures appeared in. And these installation views are important because the palpable reality of these photographs meant I could continue with making objects and photographs that would relate to our bodies, to bodies in space, and to spaces of reading. How big is a patch of gray? How large is that object represented? How big is the actual object? Things like that, which would lead to, what should we call it? Automatic conversations about the ontology of photography, the very being of photography. So a lot of what I had seen as the history of photography in caves was mostly to do with magnesium powder, glowing images in film, and other large format black and white, which were fairly low in terms of capture. So I wanted something different, something more theatrical, something that almost looked like it was constructed for a moment. That's just a process shot to show you. So that led me to a little sideline, but something still important that I'm working through now, and that is, what is sculpture in relation to photography, and what are the relationships that I can draw out, or we can draw out, in terms of wondering at how these two relationships, or how this relationship between sculpture and photography works. So, for instance, I began to look at forms and wonder what the representational force could be of some little blob, and then think about sculpture of, say, this Donatello, this Goliath head, going back and forth. I started to compare things in nature and compare things made by hand, by artists. So this is the picture by David. So I started to make pictures of sculpture as a way of bouncing back and forth between my interest in what I'd witnessed in the caves and what I was seeing afterwards. It's called Lost Monument. It's literally a lost monument outside Berlin that one has to go dig for if you want to actually see it. And recently I've been making pictures of odd still lives that have a relationship to color, but also relationship to black and white, or the lowered saturated color or chromatic setup. Still life with tire 1 and 2. And a picture like Collector also reminds me that this man dragging around these objects is also a collector of sculpture, has some thoughts about what these objects are. So I want to talk in this last section about recent color photographs, things that I've been working through related to my earlier work, related to gesture, related to figuration, related to realism, to analog photography specifically. I'll just say something quickly about that. The reason why I'm still using film is because its grain structure remains a curious procedure for me. Since I enlarge and print my photographs to what I feel is the size at which I experience the subject at hand, film grain becomes an important constituent element. Grain constitutes the various colors or tones and contains the illusion of space. As the amount of capture declines, the grain infills and creates an array of organic forms that literally draw approximations of what the camera lens records. For me, that feels the closest to the handmade. In some way represents the chance and connection to the history of cinema and the history of painting. This picture called Sunflowers. So the next series of pictures I'm going to show you are called Relationships to Chance, or color pictures based on chance, but things I've seen before. And these are large pictures, so I don't have installation shots to show you, but just to say they're larger than the color pictures I've been making previously. This is an enclosed garden, which will lead us into my next conversation and last conversation. Again, influences, things I'd seen before. This man's contemplating a pile of wet materials that I couldn't exactly identify. Maybe I should have ripped off a piece when I left, but he was still contemplating when I left. Again, by chance, in a park, young girl with a boat. She's just finished her travel down what's called the Eisbach in Munich. Man with flower. Again, the objects of enigma, the flower, the boat, the ball, the sunflowers, all things that are just seemingly literal. But for me, personally, they have this idea that they represent something else as well. And that brings me to my last group of pictures. And these are pictures that I have derived from imagination, but introduced chance. This picture is called Hive Burner. It was an attempt to make a picture about this ruin in North Vancouver, adjacent to across the water, where the oil from the interior of our country comes to the coast of British Columbia, conjoined by First Nations land to the west and to the east. So it's a hive burner base. This is hallowed ground in the sense that this is a ruin for which most people wouldn't know what this object once was, but it was a burner of just excess of waste, wood waste. And now it has become a closed garden, an enclosed garden, so to speak. And it represents something that I'd seen in the history of painting and something I wanted to make a work in relation to. That is this Lucas Cranach group of paintings. I mean, I don't know if there's more than 2 or 3, but Cranach was an interesting artist in that if he found a motif that was popular or he was enthralled with, he would make many, many versions. So this one's called The Golden Age. There's a second version. But the identifying features of, like, say, an entranceway or a low brick wall, figures. Here we have, of course, the golden age of some kind of Garden of Eden, animals, etc. My figures, of course, much more restrained, but I felt that this was a authentic retelling of how the space is used, because some of the figures are just shot in space. It's actually shot near the end of October, which is an interesting time to be making photographs because foliage has lost most of its thickness and a lot more light is coming through. And there's more of the sort of narrative available, so to speak, to be represented. The picture I'll end off with is called Expulsion. Again, derived from imagination, but with chance. This is the same structure, but from the back. This is the second of three pictures in this group. The third picture is still in process. So from the back, this structure is now, in my mind, conceived of as another moment, say hours later, or maybe even days later, that the enclosed garden has now become a prospect for danger. Prospect where visibility is dangerous, where moving and transiting is dangerous. For me, this picture now relates to the history of photojournalism because it depicts subjects dealing with a state of social transgression, where the accursed try to avoid the stain of representation and avoid being detected or recorded. And the inspiration for this piece for me was Masaccio's Expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is an obvious choice. We were probably most familiar with this piece. But the interest for me, again, is the configuration and combination, shall we say, of the photojournalistic moment where transgressions in photography, often people hold their hands up to their face if a crime photographer, a journalist is trying to photograph them in the middle of their, let's say, apprehension, or yes, their sight or their visibility. So that something given to us by Ouija or other photographers seemed to me to be a great analogy across time, say from the 1400s till now. So those gestures were important in the reading or potential reading. Again, things can be tentative. Nothing has to be clearly defined. I'm still firmly in the belief that ambiguity is an ethical place. And a last little black and white picture from 1996 of a very badly lit Musée d'Orsay of the Courbet wall. And that concludes my talk.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have the time for a couple of questions. I think there's a number of questions, more specifically on the ethics of street photography and photographing people on the street. Can you elaborate on the process or on this idea of the proper way to do that? Do you discuss with people prior? You said you asked permission to the young man you photographed in Germany, but is that how you proceed every time?
It's not how I proceed every time, but let's see, how do I think about it? There's legalities, and then there's the golden rule, shall we say, the human condition. So I'm interested in making pictures. I like to think what I make is at the core empathetic and about building some kind of perceivable nobility of subject. So I never feel like I'm making pictures that are about anybody's disadvantage in terms of imaging. So I do ask when it's available. When I perceive that this person might not want to be photographed, I will ask them. Now the next thing I'll say is there's cultural differences. So in Europe, people are not, it's a generalization. In Germany, people are not worried about being photographed. It's considered to be part of the culture. If you're holding a camera that looks like you're serious, not just your iPhone, or not, people have a tendency to maybe think that you're up to something that's worthwhile. Again, this is all just supposition. I don't know exactly how to answer this, but I think I've only had a few encounters that didn't work out the way I thought. I usually try to see if I can understand the situation before I photograph it. And most of the time I'm correct. And even when I ask people, and most of my pictures are asking somehow, people don't mind. So yeah, there's the legality, and then there's the golden rule. It's whatever people feel they can do.
Thank you. There's another question also about the process, how you work. There's something about the idea of the visual lottery. Do you only wait for it, or do you plan? Do you combine both? Can you elaborate a bit on this?
Sure. I think I tried to describe in my talk that imagination is a big part, because, well, being a kind of studio artist, I'm interested to think about things I want to do and go out and try to find them. So if I find something else on the way, well, then that was chance. But if I find sort of what I was looking for, approximately, then it becomes a kind of combination. So it's always a combination, and sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes I'm just happy to, like anybody else who makes photographs out in the open, shall we speak, so to say. You're just happy if something is interesting across your path.
Thank you. And again, this is maybe the last one on your process, directly related to how you work. But can you explain your choices in terms of photographic scale and size? Do you know in advance, or do you decide once you've taken the photo?
That's a good question. It's both. And so often I find my first inclinations when I'm making the photograph are correct. But sometimes, and often this happens, I want things to be, I plan them at a certain scale, and sometimes I find they have to be a little bit bigger, or just small little changes, but they might be insignificant to others, but to me they matter. So I think I more or less know what size they should be, but it changes a little bit once I start working with the actual objects in space.
And it's very related to it, but somebody is specifically asking about the black and white and why photos, and why you think they have to be so big.
Well, they don't have to be so big. Some of the motifs aren't that big, but the cave pictures, that original project was conceived of as very large photographs that would feel near monumental. Somewhere you would walk up to them and they would have a cave feature that would be the same size that you might perceive if you were actually in the cave. So it was sort of working backwards. That's what I wanted, and that's what I went to go and make, and had to shoot negatives at a certain size in order to have the capture to make prints that big. I couldn't imagine some of those photographs being smaller. That's just the way the project worked for me.
All right, thank you. And maybe one more question. And you talked a lot about, you know, painting and the way you remember what you've seen, or is you're not necessarily conscious about the fact that you have this image in your head and then you connect afterwards. So there's a lot of, you know, bonds between painting and photography in your work. But there's a specific question here about sculpture. And it says, did your early determination to print at live scale to get as close to bodily reception as possible, as you said, inform your recent interest in how sculpture relates to photography? Are there distinct lines of inquiry? Are you now looking for subject matter that projects a sculpture?
Yes, I mean, I would, that sounds very escapist, but yes, that's, in retrospect, yes. Sculpture is kind of amazing in some ways, because some sculptures, how do we describe it? They could be small but feel big. Something that some forms of photography can't enjoy. Maybe painting also enjoys that a small painting could feel like a very large space. I've never felt that a small photograph feels like a large space, even if it represents a large space. I'm being slightly abstract at the moment, but to answer that question, yes, sculpture does fascinate me, and how it appears to us and how we relate to it has a lot to do with how I want my photographs to appear, if possible.
All right. Well, I think that concludes our talk tonight. Thank you so very much, Stephen.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you, everybody. And I hope we can see you soon in the gallery and online, even if we can't see you online. Thank you very much, and have a good night, and have a good day, Stephen, in Vancouver.
Thank you, Gael. Thank you very much.